Hey everybody. Well, we this week are finishing out our summer series on the parables of Jesus, and I hope you're excited. It's been a fun couple of months, and so I'm excited to finish these out. But before we dive in, I'm going to start with a little story. So before we moved to Urbandale, we lived in Albert City, Iowa, which is a town of 700 people. And while we lived there, the whole 3 years that we were there, I don't know if we ever locked our doors. We would just never lock our doors. And especially after living in Chicago, which was where we were before that, we loved the freedom of not having to worry about locking our doors. And so we just lived into it. And I don't even know if we knew where our keys were most of the time. We just never, ever locked our doors. And because we never locked our doors, we would occasionally have people, very rarely, but on occasion, have people just kind of wander in our house. Usually, this was like neighborhood children looking to play with our kids, but every once in a while we would get others. It was kind of a part of the trade-off of never locking our doors. One day, there was this little girl, and I'm pretty sure she was a first grader at the time. Uh, this little girl wandered in after playing with our kids outside, and she asked me to make her a peanut butter sandwich. And she had never asked this before, so I asked some questions. It was one of those teacher in-service days in the fall where the teachers were at school but the kids were off, so they were just kind of running around and playing. And so I asked her some questions about this, and after a few questions, I realized that it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and this little girl had not eaten anything all day. See, her mom worked out of town and couldn't take off time for the kids' day off. So her kids were just kind of left to fend for themselves all day. And they were a family that depended on the school lunches to be able to have enough to eat. So in that moment, honestly, my world shattered just a little bit. And I quickly made this little girl a peanut butter sandwich. After this, I was able to rally our church community to start a program to make sure that the kids of our community make sure that they got a meal and that they had a safe and supervised place to hang out on those days off of school. And it was a really good program. I loved this program that was able to meet a very tangible need in our community. Today, we're going to be looking at a parable which talks about meeting tangible needs in the world around us. This is the parable of the sheep and the goats, and it's found in Matthew 25. And this parable is actually, you could actually say that this parable in the passage that precedes it is viewed as the climax of Jesus's teaching. So this is the last thing that Jesus says right before that narrative that leads him into Jerusalem and to the events of Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection. This is part of Jesus's discourse on eschatology, or to say that less fancy words, it's his big chunk of teaching on the end of all things. This discourse starts actually back in Matthew 24. With Jesus talking about the end of the age. He explains a little bit about that. And then he teaches about how the day and the hour of the end are unknown. That even Jesus doesn't know the day and the hour, only God the Father. So he follows up that teaching with a series of parables. There are 4 parables that he follows this up to further illustrate the looming reality of judgment and the need to be wise and faithful right up until the end. The first in that series of 4 parables is found at the end of chapter 24. And it's the parable of the faithful, unfaithful servant. In this parable, the servant is put in charge of feeding and directing the other servants, his other servants, as the master leaves for an absence. It doesn't really explain where he's going. It just says that he's leaving, and so this servant is put in charge of all the rest of the servants. This servant decides that the master is going to be gone for a really long time, and so instead of doing what the master has asked him, this servant decides he's just going to live it up. He's going to mistreat his fellow servants, and he's going to misuse his master's resources. When the master returns earlier than the servant expected, the unfaithful servant is caught doing all sorts of wrong things and is judged harshly according to those actions. So the core point of this parable is that the wise, the faithful servant, is prepared for the master's return and is doing what the master has asked when the master returns. The next three parables, the three parables that you find in Matthew chapter 25, then are commentary on this first parable, and they're further illustrations of this point that the wise and faithful servant is prepared for the master's return. So the next parable in this line is the parable of the 10 virgins. In this one, 10 virgins, 10 ladies, go out to wait for a groom to arrive for a wedding. And this groom takes a really long time. Half of the ladies were prepared for this wait, and half the ladies are not. And so those half that weren't prepared, they have to go and grab more supplies, and they end up missing his coming because they weren't prepared. The core point of this parable is to develop what it means to be wise and what it means to be ready. You need to be wise and ready, and this parable looks a little bit deeper at what that means. The next is the parable of the talents, or the parable of the bags of gold, is sometimes what it's called. And this one we're probably all a bit more familiar on. I know I've preached on this one before. It's one we hear a lot of about. This is the one about the 3 servants that are given various amounts of gold to take care of during the master's absence. 2 of the servants take what they are given and use that to make the master more money. And in return, they are rewarded with further trust and responsibility when the master returns. The last servant takes what the master gave him, and instead of using it, he buries it, and thus earns the master nothing and is met with harsh judgment for his poor stewardship. So this parable further develops what it looks like to be faithful and what it looks like to be faithful in connection to possessions, which is kind of a repeating theme throughout Jesus's teachings. The last parable, our parable for today, is the parable of the sheep and the goats. Now, this parable further develops and kind of gives us some tangible examples of what it looks like to be prepared and what it looks like to be faithful. So before we dive any further into this, I'm just going to go ahead and read the full parable. It's in Matthew 25, starting in verse 31. The sheep and the goats. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go and visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." They also will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you?" He will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. So that is the parable of the sheep and the goats. The core point of this parable and all of the preceding teachings is that judgment is a reality. The end of all things, eschatology here, involves judgment. We can't wriggle out of this. I mean, the church as a whole, the American church, doesn't necessarily talk a whole lot about that, but it doesn't diminish the fact that our reality is judgment. We and every other human are facing judgment at the end of all things. If we are marked with the sheep who have accepted the gift of grace offered through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and are producing the fruit of that gift as we live in faithful obedience to our God, that judgment is actually good news. It doesn't have to necessarily be a bad thing. This is good news. We will receive God's blessing and we will enter God's kingdom where it is promised there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. But if we are marked among the goats who have not accepted this gift of grace and are thus not producing the fruit of that gift, that judgment is very bad news. We will receive God's condemnation and we will be cast out of his presence, cut off from the source of all joy, and left with only mourning, crying, and pain. Judgment is our reality, is the coming reality. There's no way to escape it. Another thing this text teaches us, and particularly this parable, is that judgment doesn't necessarily line up with our human expectations. So when we're talking about sheep and goats, sometimes we assume that even if these things don't seem really obvious to us, they must have to Jesus' original audience. But that line between sheep and goats would not have been obvious to Jesus' original audience. Particularly for those of us that have grown up reading Jesus's teachings, where he talks about sheep a lot. We kind of assume that sheep must have had a positive context in Jesus's day, but they didn't. While they were not considered unclean according to Jewish law, shepherds were considered suspect in their society. They were considered lazy. They couldn't testify in court. There was not a good connotation to shepherds. Sheep probably would have more of the connotation of maybe cattle today. So when you're being called a sheep, kind of like being called cattle, you're kind of smelly, probably not too smart. I mean, it's not necessarily a compliment, right? And goats didn't have any better connotation. I mean, sheep and goats, they weren't really any different, or, sheep weren't necessarily inherently better or worse than goats in that day. I mean, sheep offered wool and meat, and goats offered milk and meat, but they're about the same. It's only through the explanation that the audience sees what was meant by this separation. So when God is separating who's in and who's out of his blessing and out of his kingdom, Jesus's audience would expect that line of separation, that line between the sheep and the goats, to be taken as that line between the Jews and the Gentiles. We as modern audience probably hear this and take this to be the line between churchgoers and the unchurched, right? It would have been shocking to hear that this line, this demarcation, was actually not along any of the lines that we assume it would be, not along ethnicity or tribalism that we as humans fall into so easily. It wouldn't even have been along necessarily religious or identity markers that we cling to. And it wasn't even along the lines of wealth or who do we see that is blessed here on earth, they must be blessed in heaven. That line is drawn based on somebody's actions, on their actions. And that is a different than what we as humans tend to expect. So if you've been in the church for a while, and especially if you've read a lot of the writings of the Apostle Paul, you might hear that line is drawn according to our actions. You might be wondering, what does this mean for the interpretation of our salvation being based solely upon our faith in Jesus and solely upon God's gift of grace through Christ? That the difference between faith and works, right? We tend to talk about this. How does this fit into that? If judgment is based on our actions, wouldn't it be saying that it's not based solely on our faith? For that, I'm going to have us read a little bit in James, because James talks about this kind of dichotomy we put between faith and works, specifically in James chapter 2. I'm going to read starting in verse 14. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. So that faith without works is dead. And what does this mean? Why? Because faith is more than simply belief. It's more than simply intellectual assent, meaning I agree with that. The word faith, as it's used in the New Testament, actually carries with it far more meaning than our English translation of faith that represents. It carries with it, yes, belief, but it also carries with it the idea of trust and faithfulness, or kind of allegiance, obedience, doing what you're asked. So being faithful and having faith means being faithful to God's central commands, especially those that are highlighted by Jesus, to love God and to love our neighbor. You can't do that without responding in compassion to your neighbor, to the downtrodden and the oppressed around us. So, what does this faithfulness look like then? It means loving the downtrodden and the oppressed around us, right? And that's feeding the hungry. That's giving drink to the thirsty. That's welcoming in the stranger or the foreigner. That's clothing the naked or the underdressed, the ill-prepared. That's visiting those that are sick. That's visiting those that are in prison. And that one, I don't know if I'd caught that one before, but I caught that one this time, and I thought to myself, I've never done that. In high school, we toured the local jail and even the state penitentiary in like a very thorough civics class, but I've never visited an inmate. But there are designated ministries that do just that, that go into prisons and visit them. That's actually our Youth for Christ consultant, or I guess representative maybe, in Urbandale. He actually left this ministry so that he could go and be a part of a ministry geared towards youth in detention centers, to going into these prisons and visiting the inmates there. So that's kind of what we talk about, is feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, being with those that are sick, visiting, welcoming in the stranger, giving clothes to people, like all of these things. That's what it looks like to meet the needs and to be faithful. It looks like recognizing them, recognizing the needs, and then taking steps to actually meet those needs in the world around us. And that's done individually, like I give a person a peanut butter sandwich individually, but that's also done corporately, as we together come together to meet needs. That would be like the garden, is meeting a need of feeding those that are hungry. And that's responding to the call or to the opportunity when it arises. Sometimes these things happen unexpectedly, and we have to respond in that moment and not just keep walking. So the main takeaway of this parable then is that the kingdom of God comes with both limitless grace, forgiveness for our sin and our brokenness, comes with limitless grace, but also with limitless demand. If our faith looks like a one-time decision, and then, filling a pew, and that's it, that's not the kind of faith that Jesus or our scriptures talk about. That's not what he's talking about. Our faith is more than that. A couple of weeks ago, Pastor Tyler was talking about the cost of discipleship. The cost of discipleship is a reference to this limitless demand. It costs us something. It requires something of us to have faith It requires something of us to be disciples. If we are agreeing to live in full allegiance to Christ, that means that we're going to have to sacrifice all in order to be obedient to our God. If we are agreeing to submit to the process of sanctification, which involves taking every last bit of sin and selfishness in us and bringing it to the surface, bringing it to light so that it can be redeemed, I mean, that is not an easy process. That is not a comfortable process. That requires something of us. It demands something of us. This limitless demand means that we will not only be judged for what we do, for our actions, but we're also going to be judged for our inaction. And that's a hard one. That's a hard one to hear. So those times that we've turned a blind eye to the pain and to the struggle of the world around us, there's judgment for that. Those times when we've allowed an overcrowded schedule or our perceived responsibility to those that look like us and think like us and act like us, to our friends and to our family, to those that are in our club, our perceived responsibility to those, when we've allowed those things to be an excuse for not acting when we're faced with need, we're going to be judged for those. This demand for action and the promised judgment for inaction, well, it might make you say, hey, wait, nobody's showing up and asking for a peanut butter sandwich. What am I supposed to do now? And I that's where I'm at. Nobody's showing up with asking for a peanut butter sandwich. What do I do now? Because in the suburbs, it's really rare for somebody who's hungry or thirsty or otherwise in need of help to just show up in your kitchen. It's not happened once since I've been here. Our neighborhoods tend to hide the needs a little bit better than they did in Albert City. With our many single family homes and our really well demarcated property lines, our closed garage doors and our shut blinds and our super high fences, it's sometimes hard to even meet your neighbors, let alone get to know the people in your neighborhood well enough to see the needs that they have. But just because those needs don't appear in your kitchen doesn't mean that there aren't people with needs all around us. I mean, in Urbandale has really high housing costs, as do some of the other Des Moines suburbs, right? We've got really high housing costs, but nearly 1/3 of the students in our immediate neighborhood around the church qualify for free lunches, meaning that their household income falls below the national poverty line. That means that even if their homes or their apartments look good, look presentable, these families are what we would consider house poor, meaning that far more of their income is going to pay for housing, and they are struggling to pay for all of those other expenses like food and clothing. There are needs here, right here. We just might have to look a little bit harder to see them. If we want to extend love in a tangible way to the world around us, if we want to be counted among the sheep, right? We have to be a bit more aware of what's going on around us. We have to leave our proverbial doors unlocked. We have to have our eyes open to see the needs around us, and we have to be ready. We have to be prepared to respond with action to those needs. So my challenge for you, Pastor Tyler and I are going to be gone for a couple weeks, so I'm giving you a bigger challenge with a little bit longer to actually enact it. So instead of a 1-week challenge, I'm giving you a 2-week challenge. My challenge for you for the next couple of weeks is to look for the needs in our community. Especially in this time of COVID-19 when things have been kind of turned upside down and we're trying to get things put back together, but we're really not sure where things are landing right now. There are needs all over the place. And many of these are new needs, or if they're old needs, they're far greater than they were before. And many of these needs are not yet being addressed by our government, by our community, by even the churches in our community. There are just needs all over the place. We just have to have eyes to see them. So my challenge to you is to spend the next couple of weeks with your proverbial doors unlocked. I want you to spend intentional time, to intentionally set aside time and energy to look for the needs around you. Look for those that are hungry, that are thirsty, that are lonely, that are without adequate clothing or housing, that are sick, that are marginalized, that are oppressed, that are just unsupervised. There's all sorts of needs. I want you to look for those needs. And that could be going on prayer walks through your neighborhood and asking God to give you the eyes to see the needs that our suburbs do so good at camouflaging. That could be observing what's going on around you when you're out and about. So look at what's going on in parks, look what's going on in the streets, look what's going on in the aisles of the stores while you're out shopping in your community. I want you to look for the needs. And if you're faced with a tangible need that you have resources to address, do it. Give them the peanut butter sandwich. Do it. If you come across a need that is bigger, I want you to bring it to the church. Email me. Send me those needs. And we can, as a group, communally seek the guidance of the Spirit to see what we as a church, or maybe if it's a really big need, what we as the churches in our area can come together to do to address that need. All of the most fruitful ministries of the Big C Church start from one person looking around and seeing a need and speaking up. Let's look. Let's see what we can find. If we want to be able to face that coming judgment, that promised judgment that Matthew spends 2 chapters talking about, right? If we want to be able to face that as the sheep, if we want to be able to face that judgment as good news, we need to respond in faithfulness to God's call for us to extend his love to the least of these in the world around us. May God give each one of us the eyes to see the needs around us. And may God give our community the boldness to act in obedience to his call. Blessings.